At 3:47 a.m. on October 12, 1942, a thin sheet of fog clung to the steel trusses of a railway bridge outside the German-occupied town of Zmigrod, Poland. Specialist David Mercer pressed his chest against the cold girder, breath misting as he tightened the final loop of cord around a bundle of TNT charges. The metal beneath his gloves vibrated soft at first, then steadier as a freight locomotive approached from nearly 700 yards down the line. He felt the rhythm through his ribs, a low, mechanical thump that climbed up the steel and into his bones. Far below the bridge, a German patrol moved along the riverbank, boots crunching over wet gravel. Mercer paused each time a flashlight beam swept across the support beams, counting the seconds between passes. They were too close. Much too close. And the rest of his three-man sabotage team, hidden in the shadows near the opposite abutment, whispered updates he didn't need. 30 seconds, Mercer. Maybe less. Everyone knew the truth. There was no time left to follow the manual. According to U.S. engineer doctrine, a proper rail demolition required, charges placed beneath the rail, a 300-foot safety pullback, a timed fuse, and cover before detonation. That was the safe way. The correct way. The way Mercer had practiced 100 times at training grounds, far from the smell of diesel and wet iron. But none of that was possible here. Days of rain had turned the soil under the bridge into a pit of mud, making it impossible to slip charges beneath the rails. The patrol below meant they couldn't retreat to a safe distance without being spotted, and the fuse line soaked by fog for hours was now unreliable, its burn rate slowing by seconds that Mercer didn't have. What he held in his hands was the only chance left. A plan nobody approved, a method nobody taught, a technique every engineer he'd ever worked with would have laughed at. The train's headlights swept into view through the fog. Mercer tightened his grip on the improvised pressure trigger, the cold steel biting into his palm. 10 seconds, someone hissed. Mercer didn't respond. He was already anchoring himself against the beam, bracing for the moment the locomotive's weight would decide whether he lived or the bridge disappeared in a flash of fire and steel. The fog thickened around the bridge as the locomotive's distant rumble settled into a slow, steady pulse that seemed to vibrate through every rivet in the steel frame, creating a rhythm that merged with Mercer's breathing in a way that made the entire structure feel alive beneath him. He shifted his weight carefully along the narrow girder, placing each boot with deliberate precision, trying not to let the slick film of moisture turn one wrong step into a fatal plunge toward the dark riverbank, where the German patrol still moved with unhurried confidence. The faint glow of their lanterns bobbed between the support beams, illuminating brief flashes of wet stone and the glint of rifle barrels, each reflection reminding Mercer that any careless scrape or clatter could bring a volley of fire upward in seconds. Overhead, the wind carried the faint metallic groan of the bridge as cold air rushed through the trusses, and Mercer lowered himself closer to the charges to steady his hands, which trembled not from fear, but from the biting chill of early autumn nights in occupied Poland. The TNT bundles lay tight against the lower girder, their cords knotted with deliberate tension, and Mercer checked each binding by touch alone, trusting his gloved fingers to find any looseness the darkness might conceal. He could smell the sharp tang of old engine grease mixed with the damp odor of river mist, a combination that clung to the steel like a second skin and made every breath feel heavy with the weight of the moment. As the locomotive drew closer, its low drone began to separate into distinct mechanical layers, the churn of pistons, the grind of wheels against rail, and the hollow resonance of the freight cars that echoed faintly across the empty valley, amplifying the pressure on Mercer's already narrow window of action. He pressed himself deeper into the shadow of the truss, imagining how the engineers back in the States would react if they saw him here, abandoning every inch of doctrine they had drilled into him, kneeling over a live charge with enemy boots, less than 40 feet below. The very idea of using the train's own mass as the detonator would have been dismissed as reckless improvisation, yet tonight it was the only approach that offered even the smallest chance of success without sacrificing his entire team. Behind Mercer, the faint rustle of fabric signaled that Corporal Haynes was adjusting his position near the far end of the bridge, trying to stay concealed while maintaining visual contact with both the advancing train and the German patrol. Haynes whispered a brief update. Distance closing fast. Mercer, maybe 400 yards. But the words carried a tightness that revealed his growing concern about the narrowing margin for error. Mercer didn't answer, choosing instead to focus entirely on his breathing, controlling each inhale and exhale to keep his pulse steady enough to execute the final adjustments with the steadiness of a machinist fitting a gear into place. The fog drifted in waves across the rails, swirling around the wooden ties and brushing past Mercer's face like phantom fingers, obscuring the approaching headlight until it flickered through the haze with a muted halo that made the entire bridge glow faintly in pale, shifting light. He reached down to check the pressure trigger again, feeling the slight give of the improvised metal tabs that would bend and close the circuit once the locomotive's weight compressed the rail. The mechanism was crude, fragile, and entirely dependent on perfect timing, yet its simplicity was exactly what made it reliable in conditions where moisture had ruined the standard fuse. Below him, one of the German soldiers paused and raised his lantern toward the bridge, casting a thin cone of light that swept dangerously close to Mercer's position and forced him to flatten himself against the cold steel until the patrol resumed its slow march along the riverbank. For a moment, the entire world seemed suspended between motion and stillness, held together only by the steady thrum of the approaching locomotive and the quiet determination that had carried Mercer through every impossible moment leading to this point. And as the darkness closed in again, he exhaled slowly, realizing that the next minute would define not only the mission, but possibly the fate of every unit depending on the destruction of the German supply line winding toward the front. A sudden burst of static crackled through Haynes's field radio, forcing Mercer to clench his jaw as the sharp noise bounced off the steel beams and threatened to draw the attention of the patrol below, whose rhythmic footsteps faltered for a moment, as one soldier turned his head upward, as though sensing something out of place in the fog. Mercer pressed his body tighter against the girder, feeling the damp metal bite into his ribs while he silently cursed the unreliable equipment that seemed determined to betray them at the worst possible moment. The radio hissed again, softer this time, followed by Sergeant Collins's low, urgent whisper, advising them that the locomotive was closing the gap faster than expected and would reach the southern end of the bridge in less than 60 seconds. Haynes shifted in the shadows, his boots scraping lightly against a patch of rusted steel, and Mercer winced at the sound, because even the faintest noise traveled far in the empty pre-dawn air, where every vibration seemed amplified by the cold. Collins hissed a warning for absolute silence, but his voice carried a tension that told Mercer he was wrestling with his own rising panic as the situation tightened around them like a knot being pulled from all sides. The German patrol halted again, their lanterns swinging gently as they whispered among themselves, and Mercer felt a spike of heat rush up his neck, despite the freezing wind, because he knew any deviation from their routine could end in gunfire, erupting beneath the bridge. Above the low hum of the approaching train, Mercer began to distinguish the heavy clank of couplers, shifting under stress, followed by the deeper metallic resonance of ammunition crates rattling inside the freight cars, an unmistakable signal that this was not an ordinary supply run, but a fully loaded transport critical to Germany's frontline operations. The weight of that realization pressed on him more heavily than the steel structure he clung to, because it meant failure was not just a tactical setback, but a blow that would allow enemy forces to resupply their units exactly when Allied resistance was already strained across multiple sectors. The fog thickened again, swirling around Mercer's boots and creeping along the beams like a living curtain that both concealed and distorted the world around him, making it harder to judge distances or anticipate the patrol's movements. Collins muttered that one of their detonators had absorbed too much moisture and might require manual stabilization, and though his voice was nearly silent, the frustration and fear lacing every word made it clear their margin for improvisation had almost evaporated. Mercer wanted to respond, to reassure him that the pressure trigger setup would compensate for the equipment failure, but the presence of the patrol so close below kept him silent, forcing him to rely on hand signals and slow, controlled breaths to communicate resolve. A faint metallic ping echoed through the bridge structure as the first freight car crossed a point somewhere beyond the curve, and Mercer felt his pulse lurch, because that sound meant the locomotive had entered the final approach, where braking was impossible, and the full rolling weight would soon press down on the rails with irresistible force. Haynes whispered that the patrol was doubling back earlier than expected, which meant they would pass directly beneath Mercer within moments, narrowing his window of action to a razor-thin sliver that demanded absolute precision. Mercer steadied himself against the tremor of impending danger, feeling every bolt in the bridge vibrate as the approaching train's energy traveled through the steel like a warning. Collins tapped his watch twice, signaling that they had mere seconds before the locomotive emerged fully onto the bridge, and Mercer's throat tightened as he imagined the awful intersection of variables: fog, patrol, faulty detonators, and collapsing time, each one capable of destroying the mission alone, but now converging at once in a suffocating cascade of pressure. He could sense Haynes shaking behind him, not with fear, but with the raw physical strain of holding a firing position in near-freezing temperatures for almost an hour, while listening to every sound with the intensity of a hunted animal. For a brief moment, Mercer wondered if the others understood just how thin the line was between success and catastrophe. But he pushed the thought aside because doubt had no place here, not when the mission's entire fate depended on a trigger built from scrap metal and nerve. As the locomotive's headlight grew brighter through the fog, Mercer inhaled deeply, drawing in the metallic scent of the bridge mixed with the faint odor of engine smoke, and allowed the rising chaos around him to sharpen rather than overwhelm his focus. Every sound, every vibration, every breath of wind now mattered, forming a brutal symphony of converging threats that left no margin for hesitation. And in that tightening storm of noise and danger, the mission entered the final stage, where failure would come instantly, but success, if achieved, would reshape the battlefield before dawn. The official demolition procedures, taught to every combat engineer in 1942, emphasized a rigid sequence of actions that had been refined through decades of training grounds, field manuals, and cautious instructors who valued predictability over instinct, requiring soldiers to treat explosives not as weapons but as delicate tools, whose effectiveness depended entirely on disciplined consistency. Mercer remembered those instructions with absolute clarity as he knelt against the cold steel, recalling how instructors at Fort Belvoir would pace behind the trainees, repeating the same mantra about precision and distance until the words felt etched into the bone. According to the manual, a successful rail demolition began with the identification of a structural weakness along the line, typically at a joint or low point where the rails connected to supporting beams, which allowed the charge to exploit existing stress points for maximum destructive efficiency. Engineers were trained to approach the selected section from below whenever possible, sliding the explosive charge beneath the rail's underside so that the blast would force the metal upward and sever the track cleanly, creating a break impossible for a train to pass without catastrophic derailment. Once the charge was set, the procedures required laying out a timed fuse of measured length, ensuring a delay long enough for the demolition team to retreat at least 300 feet to safety before detonation, allowing fragments and shockwaves to dissipate without threatening the crew. Every step was taught with almost religious repetition, from the angle at which the TNT should be pressed against the rail, to the correct tension needed on the fuse line to maintain a consistent burn rate under varying temperatures and humidity levels. Instructors drilled into their students the importance of avoiding improvisation, insisting that deviation, no matter how minor, introduced unacceptable risk both to the mission and to the men responsible for carrying it out. They emphasized that field conditions, no matter how chaotic, should never justify abandoning the method, because standardized procedures kept teams alive while still achieving predictable, measurable results that commanders could trust. Mercer could almost hear the voice of Sergeant Whitman, his primary instructor, describing in stern detail how the manual's prescribed sequence existed because countless engineers before them had died refining it, and that treating the procedure like optional guidance rather than strict doctrine was the mark of an undisciplined soldier unfit for the responsibility of handling explosives. The memory pressed against his thoughts now as the fog thickened around him, reminding him of the gulf between the sterile training grounds of Virginia and the brutal constraints of a bridge in occupied Poland, where none of those carefully crafted steps could actually be followed. The manual demanded time that he did not have, insisting on safe withdrawal routes that simply did not exist on a bridge patrolled by armed soldiers only a few dozen feet below. It required dry fuse lines with predictable burn rates, which the fog-drenched night had rendered unreliable and dangerously inconsistent, despite their careful handling throughout the march. It depended on the ability to position charges underneath the rail, yet the soaked earth near the riverbank had collapsed into mud so deep that even the smallest attempt to tunnel under the track would have created noise loud enough to alert the patrol. Still, the logic of the procedure lingered in Mercer's mind, reminding him how the system was designed to protect men in countless situations across Europe by giving them a stable, dependable approach to controlling immense destructive force. He recognized that the method was built on a foundation of caution, intended to preserve life whenever possible, and that its rigid structure was meant to anchor decisions when stress and fear threatened to overwhelm human judgment. He respected that philosophy deeply, even now, because it had saved the lives of countless engineers long before he had ever set foot on a battlefield. But as he listened to the freight train's thunder grow louder, merging with the faint echoes of the patrol beneath him, Mercer also understood that the manual had never accounted for nights like this, where the margin between success and discovery had evaporated entirely, and the enemy's schedule and terrain had erased every sanctioned option. The doctrine served the needs of the many, not the impossible circumstances of a single team pinned between a strengthening locomotive and a tightening patrol route. And with each passing heartbeat, he realized that the rigid steps drilled into him for months had become not a guide to victory but a guarantee of failure. In that moment, as the vibrations intensified and the rails began to sing with approaching weight, Mercer accepted that the manual had fulfilled its purpose, not by being followed, but by teaching him enough to recognize when it had to be abandoned for something faster, riskier, and entirely his own. The deeper Mercer evaluated the bridge, the more brutally obvious it became that every step of the standard procedure had been rendered impossible by a combination of terrain, weather, enemy presence, and simple bad luck that no amount of training could have anticipated. The earth beneath the track, normally firm enough to support discreet tunneling, had turned into a thick, sucking slurry after days of relentless rain, transforming the lower embankment into a swampy mire, capable of swallowing a boot to the ankle with every step, ensuring that any attempt to position charges beneath the rails would create enough noise to alert the patrol instantly. The wooden ties, swollen with moisture, groaned loudly under shifting pressure, making stealth nearly impossible and amplifying the danger of even a single misplaced movement. The fog, usually a welcome ally for sabotage teams, had betrayed them tonight by saturating the fuse line until its burn rate became wildly unpredictable, turning a normally precise timing tool into a gamble more likely to ignite too late or too early, depending on the thickness of the mist and the temperature of the steel rails. Mercer tested a short section earlier in the night and watched in frustration as the flame crawled slower than expected, hesitating as droplets collected along the line and distorted its progress in ways no manual could account for. The idea of trusting such an unstable fuse with their lives, especially with a critical supply train approaching, felt less like engineering and more like blind faith. Meanwhile, the German patrol posed a far greater obstacle than their slow, meandering pace suggested, because their lanterns cast sharp beams across the underside of the bridge at irregular intervals, creating unpredictable patterns of illumination that forced Mercer and his team to freeze repeatedly in uncomfortable positions. The men below were not the bored, careless sentries Mercer had hoped to encounter, but disciplined soldiers accustomed to detecting guerrilla activity, each movement measured with the wary patience of men who had already survived multiple sabotage attempts along the supply lines. The unpredictable timing of their route meant that any retreat of more than a few yards risked exposure, making the mandated 300-foot withdrawal distance a logistical impossibility. Even the bridge's structural design worked against them, because the steel trusses limited access to the lower joints where demolition charges were most effective, forcing Mercer to crawl through narrow gaps that scraped against his pack and sometimes caught the edge of his jacket, each sound magnified by the bridge's metallic resonance. The small compartments between beams left little room to maneuver, and the vibrations from the approaching locomotive only intensified the difficulty of maintaining balance while attempting delicate adjustments to the explosives. Every shift of weight risked knocking loose a pebble or sending a faint clatter down the girders, either of which could draw the soldiers' attention. Compounding these problems was the composition of the train itself, which carried ammunition crates that added unpredictable harmonics to the rail vibrations, making it difficult for Mercer to time the precise moment when the locomotive would reach the optimum pressure point needed for a clean detonation. The standard procedure relied heavily on predictable acoustic cues, yet tonight those cues were muddled by the inconsistent echoes created by the surrounding fog and the dampened resonance of the waterlogged wooden ties. The unpredictability made any timed fuse already compromised by weather practically useless. Resources were dwindling as well, with half of their equipment rendered unreliable after the march through the rain-soaked forest, leaving Mercer with only a few functional charges and a handful of improvised components that could not be configured in the careful, symmetrical pattern the manual demanded. Instead of a well-structured demolition layout, he had a cramped scattering of possibilities, each one shaped by the narrow confines of the bridge and the relentless urgency of the ticking moments. All these factors converged into a singular, suffocating realization. The standard approach, disciplined and perfected as it was, had no place on this bridge tonight. It was not merely flawed under these conditions, it was impossible. A procedural dead end that would doom the mission and every man involved if followed. And as the train thundered closer, the rails shuddering with the promise of immense destructive force, Mercer understood that the only viable path forward required complete abandonment of doctrine and full commitment to the improvised, hazardous plan forming in his mind. The moment Mercer realized the manual could no longer save them arrived not with a dramatic revelation, but with a quiet, sinking certainty that settled into his chest as the vibrations of the approaching locomotive began to merge with the pounding of his own heartbeat. The weight of the situation pressed down harder than the cold steel beneath him, forcing him to acknowledge that every carefully memorized step, every instructor's warning, and every standardized procedure had become a chain pulling him toward inevitable failure rather than guiding him toward success. He inhaled slowly, letting the frigid air burn his lungs, and felt the final strands of hesitation snap as he confronted the reality that the mission's fate now depended entirely on his willingness to abandon everything he had been taught. For a brief moment, he imagined Sergeant Whitman standing behind him, shaking his head in stern disapproval, while reminding him how deviations from protocol had cost engineers their lives on battlefields stretching from North Africa to the Italian front. Yet, even that internal voice felt distant and hollow compared to the unmistakable truth rising through the bridge as the rails vibrated with increasing urgency, warning him that the train would reach the southern trestle far sooner than any timed fuse could accommodate. Mercer tightened his grip on the steel beam, grounding himself in the present, and understood that the rigid structure drilled into him in training simply could not exist alongside the messy, unforgiving chaos of this particular night. Haynes signaled frantically from his position behind a crossbeam, his wide eyes reflecting both fear and a desperate plea for direction, because he too sensed that time had collapsed into a narrow corridor where hesitation meant death. Collins, pressed flat against the opposite girder, attempted to steady his shaking hands while mouthing a question Mercer couldn't hear, but understood instantly what now, and how. The entire team looked to him, not because he outranked them, but because he had been trained more extensively in demolition, and had shown a quiet steadiness through every perilous hour leading to this moment. Their trust weighed on his shoulders like an additional pack of explosives, yet it also forced clarity into his mind where panic might otherwise have taken root. As the locomotive's headlight flickered through the fog, casting long, distorted shadows across the steel trusses, Mercer untied the fuse line from its anchor point and coiled it around his wrist, fully aware that this single action symbolized his complete rejection of the doctrine that had guided him since the first day of training. The soaked fuse, unreliable and sluggish, no longer represented safety or precision, but rather a liability capable of destroying them all through misfire or delay. He could almost hear the disbelief of his instructors if they could see him now, discarding the very tool meant to guarantee survival and reaching instead for an improvised mechanism no manual had ever endorsed. Mercer retrieved the small metal tabs he had fashioned earlier from scrap wire and the hollow casing of a broken signal flare, and the sight of those crude pieces somehow steadied him, reminding him that engineering was not solely about following instructions, but also about adapting to environments that never behaved the way textbooks demanded. The pressure trigger he intended to build was dangerous, imprecise, and alarmingly sensitive, yet it offered something the standard procedure could not: certainty that the massive weight of the locomotive would activate the charge exactly when it reached the critical point above the explosives. It was a tool born not from theory, but from necessity, shaped by the constraints of a bridge too exposed for retreat and a patrol too attentive for mistakes. A distant metallic howl signaled the train entering the straightaway that led directly to the bridge, and Mercer felt the final boundary between thought and action dissolve as he accepted that survival now depended on fully embracing the improvised plan taking shape in his mind. He gestured sharply to Haynes and Collins, signaling them to reposition for minimal visibility, then lowered himself until his chest pressed against the cold steel once more. The world narrowed to the sound of his breathing, the pulse in his ears, and the rising thunder of the approaching locomotive. In that tightening corridor of time, with the fog swirling like smoke around him and the rails trembling beneath his palms, Mercer committed himself to a plan that every manual warned against, every instructor condemned, and every instinct labeled as reckless. Yet in this impossible moment, it was the only plan that offered even the faintest flicker of hope. The idea arrived not as a flash of reckless inspiration, but as a slow, deliberate convergence of necessity and instinct, forming in Mercer's mind with the cold precision of a machinist aligning gears under impossible pressure. As he crouched against the trembling beam, feeling the approaching locomotive's weight echo through the steel like a warning heartbeat, he realized that the only dependable force available to him tonight was the relentless mass of the train itself. Thousands of tons of momentum that could be shaped into a trigger far more reliable than any moisture-soaked fuse. That recognition settled into him with unnerving clarity, pushing aside every trace of doubt until the solution felt not optional but inevitable. He studied the rail, tracing its lines with his eyes and calculating how the locomotive's leading wheels would compress the metal downward by mere fractions of an inch, yet enough to create mechanical leverage if harnessed correctly. The concept resembled field machinery he had repaired during training, simple pressure plates used in communication relays that closed circuits when weight was applied, only scaled to a monstrous level and deployed on a bridge occupied by armed patrols and drenched in fog. Still, the underlying principle held, and the thought carried a strange sense of calm, as though his mind had finally found traction after slipping in chaos for so long. Mercer reached into his pouch and retrieved the small collection of salvaged components he had gathered earlier in the night, each selected for its potential to serve as part of an improvised pressure mechanism. The first piece was a thin strip of copper wire scavenged from a broken radio antenna, flexible enough to bend yet strong enough to maintain tension when anchored between 2 points on the rail. The second was the dented cap of a spent flare casing, its concave shape ideal for funneling force downward into a narrow contact area where the circuit would close. The third was a pair of scavenged nails, hammered flat at the ends and sharpened just enough to pierce the insulation of the detonator wires without cutting them entirely. As he laid these components across the steel beam, Mercer visualized the design forming in his head, recalling the countless hours spent studying pressure systems and ignition circuits in training sessions that seemed a lifetime ago. He understood that the key to success lay in creating a mechanism sensitive enough to react instantly when the locomotive's weight compressed the rail, yet durable enough to survive the violent tremors generated by the approaching freight cars. He wrapped the copper wire around a supportive bolt, tightened it with steady fingers, and formed a delicate arch that would collapse under even slight deformation, closing the electrical loop and triggering the explosives with millisecond precision. The fog swirled around him as he worked, and the faint glow of the headlight reflected off the thin film of moisture covering the steel, illuminating the improvised device with a ghostly shimmer that seemed to highlight both its fragility and its potential. Collins watched from behind a truss, his tense posture revealing equal parts hope and fear, while Haynes crept closer to pass Mercer a final piece of scrap metal needed to brace the lower connection point. Mercer nodded silently in gratitude, feeling a surge of focus sharpen his senses as the design reached its final configuration. With each adjustment, the danger grew more tangible, because the mechanism he built lacked the controlled timing of a standard fuse, and instead relied entirely on the train's mass, a force so immense it left no margin for error once set in motion. Yet that same force offered reliability that no human-activated detonator could match under these conditions, providing an automatic trigger immune to fog, stress, and human hesitation. Mercer tested the tension with a careful press of his fingertip, watching the copper arch quiver with alarming sensitivity before springing back into place, ready to collapse under the locomotive's approach. He felt the rails vibrate more intensely now, signaling that the heavy engine had entered the final stretch before the bridge, and the air around him thickened with the metallic scent of approaching danger. The pressure trigger gleamed faintly in the lantern glow from below, its crude components appearing strangely elegant in their simplicity, as though born from a design older than doctrine, and more honest than any manual he had memorized. Mercer exhaled slowly, letting the cold air sharpen his determination, and recognized that he had crossed the threshold between conventional engineering and something far more instinctive, a raw, improvised brilliance, forged by desperation and absolute necessity. This was the suicide plan his team had whispered about earlier, not because it guaranteed death, but because it demanded a level of proximity no sane engineer would tolerate, binding success and survival to the same dangerous instant when the train's crushing weight intersected perfectly with his fragile invention. Yet in that moment, as the ground trembled beneath him and the headlights began breaking through the fog with growing intensity, Mercer felt the improbable mechanism settle into place with a certainty no manual had ever offered. And he knew, with sudden clarity, that this impossible device, this fragile assembly of scavenged parts and stubborn resolve, might be the only thing standing between triumph and disaster. Mercer lowered himself along the narrow girder with painstaking precision, feeling the steel tremble beneath his palms as the approaching locomotive pushed deeper into the straightaway that funneled its growing momentum toward the bridge like a rising tide of iron and fire. He knew every movement now carried consequences measured in decibels, not inches, because even the faintest scrape could echo downward into the patrol's listening ears, yet he forced his breathing into a slow, disciplined rhythm that steadied his hands as he positioned the improvised pressure trigger against the cold, mist-coated rail. The thin copper arch shivered with each vibration, reacting to the locomotive's approach with a delicate quiver that made his fingers tighten reflexively around the mounting bracket. He secured the base of the device using a pair of flattened nails hammered silently into the wooden tie, driving them with controlled pressure from the heel of his hand. Each strike calculated to minimize noise while ensuring enough depth to keep the mechanism from shifting under the tremors that would intensify once the engine reached the bridge. Moisture dripped from the underside of the truss above him, sliding across the metal and onto his wrists in icy rivulets that made the skin beneath his gloves sting, but he ignored the discomfort and focused solely on the alignment of the detonator wires, guiding them like a surgeon threading a suture through a wound that could either heal or rupture depending on a single misjudged angle. Behind him, Collins crouched against a diagonal support beam, clutching his rifle with white-knuckled tension while scanning the lower embankment for any sign that the patrol had detected unusual activity. Haynes, positioned closer to Mercer, leaned forward with cautious intent, offering a stripped length of metal that Mercer used to reinforce the lower contact point of the trigger, creating a stable surface for the flare casing to rest against once the rails began to bow under the train's massive weight. The collaboration unfolded through silent gestures and muted breaths, an unspoken choreography shaped by trust and sharpened by the tightening noose of time, because none of them dared risk even a whispered word that might carry beyond the bridge. The fog continued to swirl around them in restless sweeps, occasionally parting just long enough to reveal the distant glow of the train's headlight, cutting through the gloom like a blade, aimed directly at the heart of their operation. Mercer adjusted the angle of the copper arch one last time, ensuring that even the slightest deformation of the rail would collapse the structure and close the circuit, then pressed the flare cap gently into position before anchoring it between twin bolts that seemed almost designed for this improvised purpose. The entire assembly trembled under his fingertips, fragile and untested yet perfect in its simplicity, a small piece of human ingenuity poised to channel the colossal energy of a charging engine into a single, decisive spark. A sudden gust of wind swept across the bridge, carrying with it the oily scent of coal smoke and the distant clatter of couplers shifting under strain, and Mercer instinctively pressed himself flat against the steel as one of the patrol's lanterns angled upward, casting a cone of pale light that flickered dangerously close to his position. He remained motionless, muscles locked and breath held, until the lantern dipped again, and the soldiers resumed their steady march beneath the structure, oblivious to the historic transformation occurring only a few feet above their heads. The close call tightened Mercer's resolve, reinforcing the knowledge that failure here would not merely cost them the mission, but would condemn the entire region's resistance effort to a crushing setback. With the light fading once more into the fog, he reached for the final element of the mechanism, a thin strip of cloth torn from his own sleeve, and twisted it into a crude insulating pad that prevented premature contact between the wires, securing it gently beneath the copper arch, with a knot practiced in training, but executed tonight with a desperation that lent new meaning to muscle memory. He double-checked the tension, pulled lightly on the anchoring point, and felt the entire device respond with a delicate resilience that reassured him far more than any standardized fuse ever could under these conditions. Satisfied at last, Mercer slid backward along the girder, mindful of the limited space and the deafening vibrations rising through the steel as the locomotive neared the threshold of the bridge. He gave Collins a brief signal, one sharp tap on the beam, then glanced at Haynes, whose eyes reflected the same mixture of fear, hope, and grim commitment that thrummed within Mercer's own chest. The improvised trigger was set, the charges were in place, and the rails themselves would decide the next chapter of the mission, leaving the team with nothing to do but brace for the moment when the massive engine crossed the invisible boundary between danger and destruction. And as the first blast of steam roared through the fog, Mercer realized that the bridge, the night, and their lives had all become bound to a fragile device of scavenged metal and courage, waiting silently for the exact instant when thousands of tons of German steel would deliver their fate. The locomotive's headlights sliced through the fog with a cold, unwavering brilliance that washed across the steel beams like a rising dawn, forcing Mercer to squint as he eased himself into the narrow wedge of shadow, offering the last sliver of concealment before the train reached the bridge's central span. The vibrations had intensified into a deep, throbbing hum that seemed to pulse through the entire structure, shaking loose droplets of condensation that pattered against his helmet in a steady rhythm that matched the rapid beat of his heart. Each passing heartbeat felt heavier than the last, and he sensed the rails shifting beneath him in small, almost imperceptible motions that signaled the locomotive was close enough to bend the steel if given only a few more seconds. Haynes pressed himself tightly against a crossbeam, his breaths shallow and rapid as he watched the oncoming engine loom larger in the fog, its growling machinery echoing through the girders like the roar of some mechanical predator closing in on its prey. Collins gripped the lower truss with both hands, his knuckles pale beneath the grime, silently mouthing a countdown that Mercer could not hear, but felt in the growing tempo of the rail's tremors. The air around them thickened with the oily scent of burning coal and hot metal, forming a claustrophobic veil that settled into their lungs and wrapped itself around their nerves with suffocating insistence. As the train approached the entry point of the bridge, the entire structure groaned under the strain, producing a long, metallic wail that vibrated through Mercer's bones and reminded him with terrifying clarity how much destructive force was barreling toward their fragile improvisation. The first wheels touched the brink of the trestle, sending a sharp, piercing tremor along the rails that rippled directly into the pressure trigger, causing the copper arch to quiver dangerously, as if preparing to snap prematurely. Mercer reached instinctively toward the device, stopping his hand only inches short as he realized that any touch now risked upsetting the precise tension required for activation, leaving him frozen in a torturous limbo where action and restraint held equal power to end the mission. The locomotive's massive front wheels rolled forward with deliberate inevitability, each revolution driving the machine deeper into the heart of the bridge until its full weight bore down upon the rail with a force Mercer could feel even through the layers of steel between them. The sound grew into a deafening roar that drowned out every whisper of wind and every distant murmur of the patrol below, reducing the world to a single, overwhelming surge of mechanical energy that filled the air with a vibrating pressure strong enough to make his teeth ache. The headlight widened, flooding the bridge in stark white light that briefly illuminated Mercer's silhouette before plunging him back into shadow as the beam shifted past his position. He sensed the final seconds tightening around him like a closing fist, squeezing away every possibility except the one that lay directly ahead, the precise instant when the locomotive's weight would compress the rail just enough to collapse the copper arch and close the circuit. The margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing, and Mercer felt the despair of uncertainty claw at the edges of his resolve as he wondered whether the device would hold together long enough to function under the immense stress surging toward it. Yet he forced himself to remain perfectly still, trusting the crude mechanism he had built with trembling hands to deliver a level of precision no standardized fuse could guarantee under such brutal constraints. The patrol below paused again, their shifting lantern beams casting ghostly patterns across the underside of the bridge, and for a terrifying moment, Mercer believed they had sensed the tension in the air and were preparing to investigate. But the train's thunderous approach seemed to distract them, drawing their attention toward the track as though the noise alone promised answers they needed more urgently than any suspicion lingering beneath the structure. Their hesitation granted Mercer a fleeting moment of relief, though the rush of fear quickly returned as the locomotive closed the last few yards, and the rail beneath him bowed ever so slightly under its weight. Time seemed to fracture then, stretching each millisecond into a moment of unbearable suspense as the engine reached the exact point above the pressure trigger, and Mercer felt every muscle in his body tense in anticipation of the decisive instant. The rail flexed with a muted metallic groan, bending just enough to force the copper arch downward, its delicate curve collapsing with a soft snap that was lost beneath the locomotive's roar. Mercer's breath caught in his throat as the improvised contacts met, sending a single, unstoppable spark through the circuit that raced toward the buried TNT charges with blinding speed. and in that razor-thin sliver of time, smaller than a heartbeat, yet vast enough to contain the fate of their entire mission, Mercer understood that the moment of no return had arrived. The explosion arrived, not as a single blast, but as a cascading eruption of force that ripped through the bridge with a violence so sudden and absolute that Mercer felt the shockwave strike him before his mind had fully processed the prizest. Blinding flash that erupted beneath the locomotive. The steel truss shuddered violently as the first charge ignited, sending a plume of fire and pulverized debris upward in a jagged burst that illuminated the fog with a ghostly, amber glow, transforming the entire structure into a trembling cage of distorted light and shadow. Mercer's hands clamped instinctively around the girder as the concussion slammed into his chest, driving the air from his lungs and leaving a ringing pressure in his ears that drowned out every other sound for several agonizing seconds. The locomotive reacted with catastrophic immediacy, its front wheels launching upward as the rails buckled beneath the focused violence of the blast, twisting the massive engine into an awkward, airborne lurch that defied its immense weight. The machine's steel frame groaned like a wounded animal as momentum carried it forward, tearing entire sections of the bridge's decking apart while its boiler ruptured in a thunderous, metallic howl that echoed through the valley with terrifying resonance. Shards of glowing metal sprayed out from the detonation point, slicing through the fog in fiery arcs that illuminated the silhouettes of freight cars pitching violently behind the derailing engine. Within seconds, the train's length began folding upon itself in a catastrophic chain reaction as the rupture in the rails sent each successive car into a frantic, unstoppable collision with the buckled debris ahead. Ammunition crates stacked within several wagons ignited under the intense shock and friction, producing smaller secondary explosions that flared along the train like a series of erupting stars, each one momentarily intensifying the blinding light that bathed the bridge. Haynes shielded his face with his forearm as a burst of flaming shrapnel ricocheted off a nearby beam, scattering embers that sizzled against the moisture-laden steel before disappearing into the depths below. Collins, clinging desperately to his position near the far truss, watched with stunned disbelief as one freight car lifted completely off its wheels and sailed sideways into the void, tumbling through the air before crashing into the riverbank with a deafening, metallic crunch that sent a plume of mud, water, and shattered timber erupting upward. The next car jackknifed violently, its coupling snapping under the strain, and allowing the remaining wagons to form a grotesque accordion of twisted steel and splintered wood that piled onto the fractured rails in a roaring avalanche of destruction. The sound was unlike anything the men had ever heard, a monstrous fusion of grinding metal, rupturing bolts, and collapsing infrastructure that seemed capable of shaking the very earth beneath them. As the chaos unfolded, the bridge's central span sagged under the building weight of the derailed wreckage, its supports bending in tortured arcs before surrendering to gravity with a sharp, echoing crack that signaled the total failure of the structure. Mercer felt the beam beneath him dip perilously, forcing him to press himself flat against the steel as the entire section lurched downward in a slow, sickening tilt that sent loose debris sliding past his boots and tumbling into the fiery wreckage below. Through the choking cloud of smoke and dust, he glimpsed the locomotive still thrashing in its death throes, steam venting from ruptured pipes as the shattered engine pitched forward and finally plunged off the collapsing span into the burning heap of freight cars beneath it. The German patrol, stunned by the sudden eruption of violence, scattered along the riverbank in disoriented panic as flaming debris rained down from above, the soldiers shouting incoherently while scrambling for cover from the shockwaves rolling outward from the collapsing bridge. Their lanterns swung wildly, casting erratic beams across the devastation before several of them were snuffed out entirely by falling fragments of steel and burning wood. The men's confusion created a chaotic scene of stumbling silhouettes briefly illuminated by the infernal glow rising from the wreckage, their previous composure shattered by the overwhelming force of the explosion. For several long seconds, the world remained a furious blur of smoke, flames, and grinding metal, until at last, the destruction settled into a deep, resonant rumble that faded slowly into the night, like distant thunder retreating across empty plains. Mercer forced himself upright, his chest heaving as he took in the sight of the obliterated convoy. 31 freight cars reduced to a sprawling landscape of ruin, stretching across the riverbed and the shattered remnants of the bridge. The success of the detonation, so uncertain only moments earlier, now lay before him in undeniable clarity, its magnitude beyond anything he had dared to imagine. and as he steadied himself against the trembling beam while the last fragments of the bridge collapsed into the burning wreck below, Mercer understood that the impossible plan he had built from desperation and scavenged metal had not only worked, it had changed everything.